all good things must come to an end. The world, in its essence, is ephemeral. And so, my long and protracted examination of Land of the Lustrous finally gets its last installment. Well, sort of. Hi, my name is Theta, and this, at last, is my look at episode 12 of Land of the Lustrous, the final episode in what is currently the only season of the anime adaptation. Since releasing the video for episode 11, the source manga has itself concluded. It ended at 108 chapters, which was no surprise. We discussed last time how that number is significant in Buddhist tradition, and so a series which invokes much of Buddhist thought has good reason to aim for such an auspicious numeral. However, for today's episode, we're going to try to minimize the amount of time spent on these Buddhist influences, not because they aren't there, but because, in the course of working on this video, I ended up deciding that I should make yet one more video for the Land of the Lustrous anime. Said video will focus specifically on its Buddhist elements, taking the entire season into account, which I think will end up being a better way to go about it and help keep this video more focused. And, selfishly, I'm just not totally ready to let go of talking about this series. I'm trying to time the release of that video to something else, which is still kind of undetermined, but hopefully that will be sometime this upcoming winter. This episode is also special compared to the others, because I made an event out of watching it for the first time, something that was mentioned in the episode 11 video. As a special send-off to the series then, I have added an extra section to the end of this video, pulling some of the questions from that stream and answering them here. One thing I shared during that stream was the mendat.org website that I used a lot for research during the writing of all these scripts. I decided to give back by sponsoring the page for Phosphophyllite. I maintain that sponsorship even now. You might conclude that I've become rather fond of this series. I thus both love and hate making this video. Join me all the same as we do what we have done before, discussing the various goals which drive our key characters, the conflicts which they attempt to resolve or avoid, the characterization of our cast as the story progresses, the world-building details that breathe life into our setting, and the elements of theme and thematic patterns which give the whole work its glue. Then I'll have a short bit of speculation for where things may go, and end with the aforementioned question and answer session inspired by the live stream. I've had such a great time with this. I appreciate everyone's patience in bringing this to its final chapter. Let us then begin with goals. Well, we finally, triumphantly, have real movement on one of the very first goals we put on the board, and at an appropriate place to add a break in the story. We'll save it for last, though, because that's more dramatic. Let's begin by re-examining the other first goal we added for Phos, join the fight. I talked about taking it off the board back in the video covering episode 9, as it seemed like the desire to join the fight would no longer steer her actions. She caught the proverbial car, and it wasn't like what she imagined. As I said then, the first moment Phos is really, truly in the fight is also the moment of her greatest failure. She fought her first battle, defeated her first Lunarian, and yet lost Antarcticite. When we joined her after the rest of winter, she was defeating Lunarians in a way that almost seemed rote, boring, a duty she was bound to carry out. It was not the cool job she so desired when the story began. That seemed largely what we were meant to take away. I wanted to revisit it though, because several episodes earlier, in episode 6, we got an extra dimension to this as a goal for Phos. In a kind of faux pas, she admits that she wants to join the fight because she loves Kongo. She wants to fight for him. In fact, isn't it the same for everyone? Skipping to the present though, how does Phos reconcile this original motivation with how she currently feels about him? It seems rather unlikely that she fights out of a love of Kongo right now, with all the uncertainty and suspicion she harbors, and yet she remains in the fight. And we consider goals to be expressly tied to characters. In fact, they are part of what characterizes them, the pursuits which drive them and matter to them. But the motivation for those goals can change without the goal itself completing or being abandoned. Phos's goal of joining the fight has become a standout example. She wanted to do it because it was cool, because it was important, because she loves Congo, because she's hoping to find a job for Cinnabar, because she's taking Antarcticide's place, because she wanted to show Amethyst her good side, and now, because it's the best means she has to pursue her newest and perhaps most driving goal, find the truth. Just within the shifting reasons Fos has displayed for wanting to fight, we can track her character progression over the season, which is delightfully elegant. And now, that shift helps us to appreciate how important her new Find the Truth goal will be. As the episode title indicates, this is her new work. In fact, I find myself wondering if this is perhaps the real myth arc for the overall story. That is, that it's not a story about the Gems and Lunarians vying for supremacy in a war of survival, a war in which Fos is an unlooked-for rising star. Instead, perhaps the mystery of the Lunarians and Congo's past will prove to be the real substance of the whole, and Fos has a key role to play because of her determination to get to the heart of the matter. Fos the detective, not Fos the warrior. Indeed, as a mystery, the lack of characterization for our antagonizing forces makes a lot more sense, which this episode's adventure with choking the Lunarian bears out. More on that later. As I mentioned in the last video for episode 11, in some ways, Fos's entire journey has been in service of this goal to find the truth. The inciting event for the whole thing was being assigned to the encyclopedia task, compelling Fos to start looking for things that were unknown. And as we've also discussed, Congo's rationale was that Fos's temerity was part of why she was suited for such a task. Her maverick attitude makes her uniquely qualified among the population of gems. She questions rather than simply accepting. She defies. Importantly, the first event of this episode adds to and qualifies that condition. Padparadscha gives Fos advice after hearing about her quest to find the truth for herself. She makes an analogy that she wishes Rutil would give up on the puzzle of fixing her, but asks what kind of reaction would that provoke? After trying 300,000 operations to fix Padparadscha, how would Rutil feel to learn that her efforts were unwanted? Oof, that would no doubt hurt. Thus too might anything Fos learns in her quest. As Padparadscha says, a pure, unbridled truth might leave its own wounds. It might change things in ways Fos never imagined. She advises Fos to keep her composure and mind her actions. And then she's asleep again, so I guess she had a lot of faith in Fos understanding what she said the first time. As related to her goal then, this advice should have a tempering effect on how Fos goes about her pursuit. It is, in fact, what we are left off with at the end. Fos is called to a meeting with Congo in a direct mirroring of the first scene, though with a greatly changed Fos. We actually have no idea what he's going to say to her since it ends there, but as she awaits, she is running Padparadscha's words back through her mind about keeping composure and being mindful of her actions. The impression I believe intended is that this goal of Fos drives the next stage of the story, but it's important that it is the new, evolved Fos who will not be reckless in the same way as the one we met in episode 1. She's seen a lot of pain, experienced loss, caused grief for others, disappointed others, been betrayed, and found that some of the things she longed for would instead leave a bitter taste in her mouth. It is a much humbled and much more sober Fos who faces into the future. That's a bit of a downer note to end this section on, and so we won't. Let's talk about that other first goal of Fos, find a place for Cinnabar. For evidence of the progress on this goal, I present the following clip. Ladies and gentlemen, we got her. Well, sort of. Technically, Cinnabar rejects the offer of working with Fos to uncover the truth of Congo and the Lunarians, but only because Fos doesn't yet know what she's going to do with that information. It seems rather implied that Cinnabar would help her, would accept this job, so long as the conditions are right. And honestly, I appreciate that she wasn't just neatly wrapped up in a bow. The kind of contentious awkwardness of that scene so well suits these two characters, outsiders in their respective ways. The job isn't fun at all, Cinnabar decries, echoing Fos's lofty promise back to her in her own words. And Fos admits as much, admits that so far her seeking has only led to more questions, that she will try again later. And if you didn't understand any of the subtext in that scene, It wouldn't look like an important step for this goal at all, but it is. In fact, it is arguably the payoff for our finale, giving us a sense of resolution to one of our many outstanding through lines. Ultimately, it's not about the fun, cool job at all. It's about the fact that Phos needs her, chooses her. Phos doesn't suggest some other task that isolates Cinnabar in a different way. She suggests one that integrates her. I want your help, in essence, is Phos saying, I want you. And this is such a natural place for us to have ended up, because Phos's whole original thing was about wanting Cinnabar to stay on the island rather than running off to the moon, that she wanted her here and not there. No matter how Cinnabar seemed to brush her off then, the truth is that meant a lot. She doesn't repeat a summary of Phos's words back to her, she repeats them verbatim. They resonated, they gave her hope, and just the perfect repetition itself is enough to invoke the luminescent blush, for surely Cinnabar realizes what it implies. Cinnabar is not so easily caught for all her vulnerability, and yet the things she details as hesitations only further convince Phos that she is the right person for a partnership. And so, while this goal would technically stay on the board going forward, a lot of the spirit of it has been met. After all, I didn't call it find a job for Cinnabar, I called it find a place for Cinnabar, and that place is beside Phos. With Cinnabar's final words, she admits that, well, if it's just a team up, implying that if Phos wants a partner sometime, I guess she wouldn't mind. Coming from Cinnabar, that might just be one step short of a full-blown confession. Importantly, this bit comes after another mirrored scene like the one we mentioned earlier between Kongo and Phos. Cinnabar repeats her words from the end of episode 1 about wanting to be free of the night and how she feels nothing but distrust. Yet these words about teaming up are a new addition. They are evidence of an important change in the same way that Phos's different demeanor and appearance are evidence of an important change. In fact, this leads into a whole montage of the gems displaying various changes from things earlier in the series, but we will come back to that. My last thought on this is that, without setting out to do so, Phos has integrated separate goals into one. Her driving determination to find the truth is not something she does instead of trying to help Cinnabar, or as a stop on the way to doing so. They are now part of the same mission. Giving Cinnabar a more meaningful place and pursuing the unknown are things which will advance together. Becoming worthy of that truth means becoming worthy of being Cinnabar's partner, of having completed the first thing Phos ever set out to do for the sake of someone else. Now then, let's talk about conflicts. I want to focus on something a little different than normal in this section, a look back on the things which presented as conflicts throughout the season. That's the main thing we'll do. Before that, though, let me mention one possible new thing. There's no news about continuing the anime adaptation of this work, so it may be silly to add anything to the board, but I would suggest a conflict of Kongo's unknown allegiance. We spoke about this last time, that he may not be deceitful out of malice, but rather out of caution. It thus may be that there is no conflict here in terms of a threat to the gems, that Kongo is not some kind of sleeper agent or hidden mastermind plotting their demise, but the very fact that it's possible he isn't what he seems, and the gems know it, means that it will likely drive the plot. The things that Phos will say or not say to Kongo are going to proceed from her perception of this uncertainty as a possible threat. We could perhaps argue that it has already affected some character actions, going back to the very beginning of the series. When Cinnabar discovers the clipboard that Phos left behind and sees the fingerprints, the evidence of Phos extending a hand to her, she is overcome with emotion. We hear her thoughts, that she wants to be free of the night, and yet she feels distrust. We didn't know where that distrust came from at the time, but last episode she revealed that she is still making up her mind about trusting Kongo. Presuming that these are related, then Cinnabar's self-imposed exile, avoiding the meetings, hibernating alone, and even how much she has kept Phos at arm's length might be as much or more about this uncertainty than it is about the threat her Mercury poses to others. After all, Phos's goal of find the truth did not coalesce into its current dominant form when she had early brushes with Lunarians, or when they took Antarcticite, or even the enigma of Shiro. It only truly became foremost in driving her when she realized there was an unknown link back to Congo. She wants to resolve this, and conflicts that the audience or characters believe are resolvable are just the sort of thing we want to discuss in this section. At least, normally. Now, let me return to what I mentioned at the outset, looking back over the previous conflicts. All of the ones I put on the board arose from things that seemed at the time like introductions into the story that might drive tension or cause reactions from characters. A few had no new developments ever, such as mention of Congo's age being quite advanced and the seeming lack of control that Cinnabar has over her silvery poison. In theory, those could matter later in the story, but never really affected this adaptation. Or, to put that better, they never presented as things that characters would try to resolve, or things which characters kept in mind when they made decisions. Several others, though, appeared to be one sort of thing and ended up being another. The squabble between Dia and Bort did not manifest into a crisis. In fact, we didn't even realize they were having problems until after Dia had already put herself in harm's way fighting with her new style. Instead, this friction became a way of driving other parts of the story, characterizing Dia, Phos, and Cinnabar during the sequences when she thought Phos had turned into a snail, providing an echo of the early Phos-Cinnabar relationship to expand Phos's understanding, and set up the context for why Bort would seek out to team up with Phos. In fact, that was another thing which seemed like a brewing conflict, but was something else. At the end of episode 9, when Phos first demonstrates her fighting prowess to the others, we get this shot of Bort narrowing her eyes, and since most of our examples of Bort's behavior to this point were aggressive, it seemed like it could presage some hostility towards Phos. Instead, Bort intended to team up with Phos, seeing her as a new asset that needed refinement. She's right, and there's a good chance that the incident with Shiro goes sideways without that decision. It also sets up a good chunk of the characterization we get for Bort, as well as that for Zircon in this episode, which we will talk about in a bit. Shiro was also a conflict that ended up quite different from the initial impression. It was not some new escalation of Lunarian threat, a super soldier come to finish matters with the gems once and for all. It was a puppy dog looking for its master. Last time I even suggested that had Bort not chopped off its hand right away, the whole thing might not have involved a fight at all. And while Shiro's presence gave us some amazing sequences of action, horror, and humor, it also led into something quite meaningful as the event which tips Phos off to a Congo-Lunarian connection. Phos herself was at the center of a bunch of these. Her being eaten by the first version of Ventricosus was indeed a conflict, and indeed needed to be resolved, but that transformation led to Phos being able to understand the speech of the Admirabilis, and presumably also why she understood the ice flows. It remains to be seen, but this may even end up extending to the Lunarians. And while she did not re-enter the story within this season, I find it hard to believe that Ventricosus has no further role to play in the overall story. Whatever it may be, it will stem directly from that initial conflict, as she and Phos's time together changed whatever she initially thought of the gems, and what things she would be willing to do for their sake. From that same adventure, we had the conflict of Phos being trapped off the island, in the Lunarian clutches, but this didn't lead to Phos being captured, or successfully used for bait for Cinnabar as I originally feared. Instead, it leads to Phos replacing her original legs with the agate ones, which is what gets Phos into the fight the first time, probably leads to her being awake during winter and allowed to assist Antarcticite, and then everything that proceeds from there. When Phos was missing and the gems spent all night searching for her under the waves, I had added a conflict of the gems are tired. That whole episode appeared to put Gem Society into a weakened state, and perhaps at real risk of a mistake if the Lunarians attacked the next day, which they actually did. But instead of being used as a plot device or altering a character decision, the exhaustion was used to set up the scene between Yellow and Rutiel and compress the time when Phos went missing with her out-of-control legs. Lastly, we had a conflict around Phos's missing arms, and perhaps what memories might have been lost alongside. The missing arms themselves ended up being a short adventure, as Antarcticite quickly concludes that they are lost for good. But that sets up a key characterization scene for her and Congo, it leads to the major development of Phos getting the golden arms, and creates a situation for Antarcticite to be captured and the resulting impact on Phos. Even though this conflict influenced the story as we expect from conflicts, the tension over recovering the arms had almost no bearing. It was merely the proximate cause of many other and more far-reaching outcomes. The memories Fos lost ended up not affecting the plot either, but I think figure into one of the things that I will discuss when we get to theme. So, what do we have looking back at this pattern? Remember that instead of examining plot as though it were one amorphous blob of just stuff that happens, we divide the narrative into goals and conflicts, things that can indicate progress in a story and are associated with characters and setting, respectively. As a concept, it might be the only useful thing I've ever contributed to story analysis. I bring it up because all of these things which presented as conflicts, a part of the plot, ended up doing far more for the story than simple narrative milestones or sources of tension. Most of them were actually the setup for important character moments, some would deliver some surprising world-building details, and almost all of them had some kind of thematic tie-in as well. The result is a story that feels richer, complicated, and less obvious in its direction. We're surprised, but those surprises are used for far more than just keeping us off balance. The way these twists integrate with theme is especially impressive for a story that has so much thematic emphasis that it occasionally borders on the allegorical. Far too many tales have their action sequences and their theme sequences, and only occasionally do the two meet. In Land of the Lustrous, though, it's been a struggle for me to segregate them out at all. And to me, that is great storytelling. Having the disparate parts of a story accomplish multiple things is the heart of that economy of theme concept that I like to bring up. It gives an audience multiple threads to be tied up in, multiple streams to be swept away by, multiple aspects to invest themselves into. It's the reason I only needed one episode of this to decide that, yep, this is the one. Lastly, this observation about the way conflicts have been used has an amusing meta tie-in to one of our later themes. It's one I brought up last time, appearances can be deceiving, and has been a pretty consistent pattern for our characters. But it's not constrained to them. We in the audience have also been led astray by how certain elements are presented. The truth has often been other than as it appeared. The world we see is a misleading mask, and that has a lot of added significance for a story invoking certain Buddhist concepts. So, let us progress to our characterization section, where we begin with two characters for whom appearances have been deceiving indeed. There were a surprising number of characters given a little extra dimension this episode, considering it was a season's finale, including an entirely new character for like 2 seconds, but we're going to start with Zircon, who isn't technically new, but whose introduction seemed largely about giving Yellow Diamond an opportunity to be characterized. Back then, I talked about Zircon being a counterpoint to Fos, as before Fos was around, Zircon was the youngest of the gems. Despite this, she seemingly had a completely opposite trajectory, bordering on overachieving, the young go-getter of gem society. Now, we get to see a different side. When she shows up in this episode, it's at the beginning of her first day as a new trial partner for Bort, and she is all nerves. Who knew gems could sweat so much? Or at all, come to think of it. Bort evidently goes the whole day and never says a word, and so we catch up later to Zircon at nighttime in complete distress. She jumps to the conclusion that Bort hates her, and this is a crisis for her. If you remember, Rutil suggested in the past that Zircon put herself in harm's way to protect Yellow because Yellow is held in such high regard as the oldest. This causes a little crisis for Yellow, but also suggests that Zircon is particularly sensitive to the idea of respect, or of honoring one's elders or betters. Bort is the unquestioned greatest fighter. Zircon understandably holds her in high regard, and so to have seemingly been dismissed by her it's a bit of a blow. Such a blow, in fact, she does the unthinkable. She goes to Fos for help. Even Fos is freaked out by this development. As they chat, though, Zircon supposes that she has been rejected because Bort's previous partner, Fos, was so above her level. Man, that is still wild to say. Zircon feels the same way, admitting she used to think of Fos as a little child despite being close in age. And yet, Fos has suddenly shot past her, and Zircon thinks, what have I been doing? If all her progress could be so easily or so quickly surpassed, then what value does it have? What kind of progress has actually been made? And perhaps Zircon is the type who derives her value from comparison with others. That wouldn't be strange for someone who puts a lot of emphasis on respect or status. Though, that can clearly be taken too far, as Zircon admits to thinking that maybe she should lose her arms or legs like Fos did, and she seems teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Now, Fos finds herself in an unusual place, as the sage, experienced one who can give advice, and she can do so without reveling in it, which might be equally unusual. Her advice is good, as a later part of the episode bears out, and Zircon is grateful, which gets them talking about whether Fos ever expected to turn out this way. And while the scene had been about contrasting Zircon and Fos in something of a reversal of how we contrasted them in the past, they end up having something in common, this idea of being jealous of one's past self. Things were simpler. They thought they understood more than they actually did, and now that they have grown, they are confronted with the difficulties of that growth. This extra time we spend with Zircon suddenly makes her seem so young, and so different than the short impression from earlier, which I now believe was misleading on purpose in order to lead us to this moment. Zircon's increased presence also helps characterize Bort, another person for whom appearances have been deceiving. Our early experiences with her made her seem like someone bullying Daya, and just a moment away from smashing Fos into bits. Well, that last part might be true. She's even rendered with narrower, more haughty eyes than the rest of the gems to heighten the impression of someone aggressive and intimidating. But, especially starting with the 10th episode, we got a more rounded look at her after she requested the team up with Fos. She is not a bully, she's fiercely protective, and has purged herself of all manner of things which could hamper that protection. We've talked at times about the tension of individual versus society, and how doing something for the good of an individual, like Fos or Cinnabar, might put others, or the group as a whole, at risk. Bort is basically way on the side of society in that spectrum. If your inadequacies threaten the whole, then who cares if it hurts your feelings to point it out? If your involvement creates unnecessary risks, then who cares if you feel useless being sidelined? Wedded to this outlook are Bort's exceptional skills at assessment. Bort is incredibly observant, and, more importantly, incredibly good at synthesizing those observations into something useful, something actionable. That was abundantly clear during the time she teamed up with Fos and they worked to deal with Shiro. In this episode, we see it again, where Bort zeroes in on Zircon's main problem being the way she was holding back because of wanting to protect Yellow. That jives with the things Yellow and Rutil said back in episode 6 and the other observations that we have made about Zircon. Even Fos could not help but admire this quality of Bort's, making the suggestion to Kongo that every gem should spend some time paired up with her. And yet, I think it's worth pointing out that this has a personal cost. The conflict with Daya is how we were even introduced to her, but it extends beyond that. Bort's curt efficiency in service of the greater good makes her a bit prickly, a bit unapproachable. We never see her just casually spending time with another gem. She is necessarily isolated and seems to have accepted this price. And it strikes me that we get a fair number of examples of the gems feeling isolated or lonely in this episode. This development between Bort and Zircon itself sets up more characterization for Yellow Diamond. While she's observing those two, and intellectually realizing it is probably a good fit, there is clearly a part of her that feels a sense of loss. Even Rutil calls her out on her attempt to pretend like it's a great idea with no reservations. Alongside this is Yellow showing up after hearing Padparadshia was awake, wanting to reminisce about the old days. Few gems are as old as Yellow, at least those who are still around, and so this is a rare opportunity for Yellow to, well, not feel so alone and isolated. One of the complexities to Yellow's character is the guilt she carries over her lost partners, and while talking out loud to the sleeping Padparadshia, we'll use this to justify why Zircon partnering with Bort is a good idea. Bort would never lose a partner like she has, and yet she clearly feels lonely having lost said partner, even though having one weighs on her fears of another loss. She asks Padparadshia to tell her it's not a bad choice, which is a kind of rhetorical device to indicate that she's mostly trying to talk herself into believing something. She then asks if it would be okay to lie down beside her, before suggesting that she's just kidding. Yellow trying to play things off is part of that cool, older sister persona that a lot of the gems perceive her to be, but we've had enough insight to realize that this is a facade. Yellow is uncertain, full of regret, and seems to be just tired. We've talked at times about how stories with immortals will frequently bring up the issues with living for so long, how much it changes your perception and your priorities. Yellow strikes me as someone for whom being alive has lost all its luster. And yet, as an immortal, she cannot simply await the embrace of death. She must go on, stretching out thinner and thinner each year. Existential angst seems to plague her, but for all that, she is still lonesome. In fact, we see her spend a lot of time with Alex throughout the episode, although most of the time she is just napping in the same room. And Alex, too, gets a little extra dimension in our finale. We've known her almost entirely as the Lunarian-obsessed one, and had the amusing reveal of Red Alex last time when we learned why she is not permitted to look at the Lunarians. She is not just a Lunarian-obsessed freak, she is a battle freak as well. Well, that obsession is played up even further in this episode, when Phos suggests that she wants to learn everything there is to know about the Lunarians. Alex is beside herself, reveling in the idea of being her sensei, to the point that she adopts Kongo's robes for her attire and can't help but try to turn the whole thing into a quiz game. But alas, Alex, Phos is a driven gem these days, and apparently in a month's time, the student has become the master, with Alex the one driven to the point of exhaustion. Having spent considerable time seeing Alex's obsession firsthand, Phos asks her an understandable question. Does she actually like the Lunarians? And we then get a perhaps unexpected answer. Alex studies them in part because of her condition, sure, but also because they stole another gem from her. She spends every day thinking about them so that she never forgets the fresh feeling of hatred she bears. Alex carries a grudge, a hate so sharp that it fuels an obsession that fuels it in turn, a snake eating its own tail. Since we don't know what she was like before, we can't guess with much accuracy how much this long grudge has changed her, or whether she herself thinks of it that way. But I can't help but notice that she, too, is an outsider in their society. Until Yellow decided to camp out in her alcove, we always saw Alex alone, unless she was interrogating other gems about their Lunarian encounters. Much like with Yellow, this episode adds a bit of pathos to this character, a peek into her inner thoughts that makes her feel more flawed, more endearing, more vulnerable. Rutil has her own similar moment. Last episode's cliffhanger was Podparadshia beginning to awaken, and so it's how we begin this one. It's not long before Rutil shows an unfamiliar side to us. Rutil has primarily had 3 modes throughout the season: a level-headed and introspective caretaker, a straight-faced troll tweaking the others, and a touch of the amoral mad scientist. Throughout all of them, she seemed self-assured, confident, in control, even as someone a bit removed from the highs and lows that the others experienced. But when faced with her former partner, an emotional and vulnerable side spills out. Rutil wasn't always the de facto doctor character for the gems, and her expertise in reassembling them isn't something she developed for the sake of such a job. Instead, it's a side effect of her real driving purpose, to fix Podparadshia's defect-riddled body, occasionally bringing her out of the constant state of slumber. One day, perhaps for good. In the meantime, though, she just finished spending 230-something years, 300,000 operations, to wake her up for perhaps an hour. While that level of dedication is characterizing in its own right, it's clear Rutil takes no pride in it. Instead, it's a source of shame that it remains unresolved. It's wild to see Rutil beside herself, expressing a sense of inadequacy. Like with Alex, we don't really know how Rutil used to be, but I find myself wondering how much the loss of her partner and the ensuing obsession have shaped Rutil in the interim. She's no less single-minded than Alex, it would seem, and perhaps no less isolated because of it. Alex's obsession is one of hate, and so something we can easily think of as damaging, hatred being seen as a negative emotion. Rutil's is the opposite, an obsession to save and heal a loved one, something that we would easily think of as positive, and yet taken to this extreme, it seems no less damaging. She seems no less alone. And Podparadshia herself admits to Phos that she wishes Rutil would give up on the puzzle that she represents. I wonder if she even could, though. How much of her identity is tied up in this pursuit after all this time? After all, it's been a recurrent theme that the gems take a sense of purpose from the jobs they carry out, and finding something each of them can do has shaped a good bit of the story. Even in this episode, We see Yellow and Dia seemingly without a real job, and seemingly aimless because of it. Indeed, once Padparadscha passes out, her time up, Rutiel seems to be her old self again, or at least the self that we are familiar with. She isn't surprised or upset that her partner is out again. She doesn't even seem to mind that Fos monopolized the short time she had. She just sets right back to fussing over her, inquiring almost with rote boredom as to what they discussed. Now, though, Rutiel no longer seems quite the unassailably self-assured gem that she first appeared. Though speaking of self-assured, let's talk about Padparadscha. She makes an impressive impact for such a tiny period on stage. We were told by Fos that she was one who practically knew everything, and since we're introduced to her alongside Rutiel having a surprising turn of uncertainty, her bearing at first blush seems like it might live up to the billing. Padparadscha has a kind of casual way about her that tends to go hand in hand with confidence. In fact, I find myself wondering now if the Rutiel that we have seen most of the time is actually her own imitation of Padparadscha's confident swagger. This confidence, though, is not cold or hostile. She tries to disarm Rutiel's dismay by attributing her situation only to poor luck, no failing on the part of Rutiel, with warm voice and smile, not a hint of distress about her situation. Once she notices Fos, and I think ascertains she was waiting on her, she shifts her focus to the former little pebble too shy to really interact with her before. Fos has obviously changed a lot, and Padparadscha no doubt appreciates that this is uncommon in gem society. I think it's worth noting how she closes the distance between them, pointing out how her arms make them alike, touching her in a comforting way, expressing a knowing sympathy that Fos had been through a lot. And then, going with her without any protest when Fos indicates she wants to ask her something. We discussed earlier the meat of their conversation, and for all that Padparadscha was billed as someone with a lot of knowledge, it seems plain to me that she's more accurately one with a lot of wisdom. But one thing that amuses me to point out is how she's presented alongside this wise display. I've mentioned in past videos the oddity of the gems having a school and school uniforms, despite not having an actual cultural link to humanity. In the case of Padparadscha, this ends up giving her something of a delinquent vibe. Check out this image of the two of them walking abreast. She walks with her shirt untucked and unbuttoned, the straps of her skirt hanging off her hips, and her stockings at different heights. She walks not with her sword sheathed in its case, but propped over her shoulders and grasped with both hands. Swap that sword out for a bat full of nails, and you'd have a spot-on example of the high school delinquent stereotype. Though that's obviously not the case, I think there's a real flippancy towards conformity implied in how she presents herself here. She's not even trying to cover up the weird holes in her torso, a mark of her inherent difference from the other gems. This is all the more stark walking beside Fos, who has decided to powder her legs to hide their perceived weirdness. Thus, when Padparadscha goes to give Fos advice, knowing full well that Fos is having a little rebellious sequence of thoughts herself, we might have expected her to encourage even further nonconformity. Rebel against society, burn it all down, to hell with order and convention. At the very least, we would not expect her to tell Fos to forget her questions, to not stick out, to keep her head down and focus on fitting in with the rest. The advice she ends up giving is neither of these two extremes. She doesn't try to steer Fos away from the path she has chosen, but she does encourage her to be mindful, to be thoughtful, to consider the possible outcomes and who might be wounded. Wise indeed, and Fos will take these words to heart. Indeed, I can imagine this advice helps reinforce why she thinks approaching Cinnabar is a good idea, as someone who is also rather wise, rather thoughtful, and maybe a touch rebellious as well. So then, very briefly, let us talk about Cinnabar. Fos will come up in the question and answer section at the end, so this is the last thing for characterization, short as it is. And because I realize that, looking back, quite a bit of Cinnabar's characterization remains unchanged from the person we met in the first episode. Confrontational but vulnerable, resourceful and yet keenly aware of all the ways she doesn't measure up and doesn't fit in. Her sensitivity makes her astute, and yet is such a liability for one whose very breathing kills the things around her. Distrustful, all but exiled, and yet doesn't hesitate to aid a fellow gem in distress. And apparently, all she really wants is for someone to find her useful, to be wanted even if it's by their enemies. Over the whole course of the season, these things remained the same whenever we did encounter her. And while I think she mostly remains the same, I dare say she is not quite so hopeless as the Cinnabar who began our tale. In an episode which highlighted the isolation of other gems, the Cinnabar stands out as the one who ends up less isolated, less alone, because Phos chooses her. It's fitting to have this episode's eye catch finally be Cinnabar's then, bookending the series with Phosphophilite from episode 1. Our two outsiders, our two malleable liquid metal gems who seem likewise to be the most flexible in their worldview, and perhaps thus well suited to questioning that world. On that note then, let's talk about this episode's world building. It should probably be little surprise that a final episode does not introduce a lot of new world building. Outside of creating a cliffhanger or a new mystery to fuel audience interest, you mostly want to be tying threads up in a final episode, not introducing new ones. And as it happens, we do have such a thing for the one bit of world building I want to discuss, a little tease to make us wonder about the truth. This comes when Phos grabs one of the Lunarians and tries to set up a quick interrogation room, which, by the way, is a rather brilliant repurposing of the cage she found herself in when she first bonded to the gold. While I'm not sure why strangling the Lunarian is Phos's go-to move, in fact, I'm not sure why the ethereal Lunarians are distressed by a blocked airway in the first place, Phos does at least understand that it makes the Lunarian helpless. It gives her power over it. And perhaps by happenstance, this disruption elicits a change in the Lunarian. Two things happen that are brand new. The Lunarian's eyes roll down, revealing an iris or pupil or both, and it makes a guttural utterance. Outside of Shiro, we haven't seen anything like this from the Lunarians, and Shiro was obviously atypical. While we understood they were fragile, Lunarians seemed most like clouds that could be swept aside. This is the first time they seemed more like something with real physicality, or a biological kind of vulnerability. Let's really focus on the eyes. Since the Lunarians are rendered entirely in this cream color with light outlines and no shading, I have been operating on the assumption that this is just what their eyes look like. It's one of the things that contributes to their eerie, alien presentation and a deliberate design choice. And after all, they shoot arrows and throw spears and pick up gem pieces, so they must be able to see, right? Well, now I wonder. Eyes rolling up into one's head to present all whites is a visual trope to indicate someone being incapacitated, or sometimes to indicate hypnosis or mind control. Having this Lunarian's eyes roll down thus gives an impression of shaking off some kind of control or some kind of stupor, as though Phos choking it disrupts the state it was in. In fact, after they roll down, we'll see them shrink as though focusing, and the Lunarian will register a look of surprise, as if in recognition, or as if it was waking up. To me, that becomes a really interesting idea when you add it to some other things in the series. Go back to episode 10, where Bort is giving Phos advice about fighting the Lunarians. She'll suggest to Phos to think of them as a single entity. As mentioned in Characterization, Bort is incredibly observant and incredibly good at synthesizing those observations into useful information. Bort's experience fighting the Lunarians has led her to notice that the Lunarians act like a single entity, that this is the impression they give off. Well, what if it's not so much that they're a single entity, but that there is a single thing controlling all of them? After all, it's been well observed that destroying a single point on each Lunarian platform causes all the other Lunarians to dissipate. Except, guess what doesn't happen this time? Cinnabar comes on the scene, Mercury nukes the whole platform, and we can see it evaporating as Phos and her captive fall to the ground, but said captive does not dissipate. It's as if it's been shaken out of whatever dependency it normally has, as though it was suddenly rendered independent. Now, the speaking becomes interesting. We've seen the Lunarians coordinate throughout the series, but never with audible speech. Either they speak in a way that Phos can't hear or understand, or they employ something like telepathy. There's two interesting scenes to help illustrate this. One is when an Antarcticite is being captured and Phos is still fighting for control of her golden arms. We'll see one Lunarian take notice of the cube and walk over as if to investigate, and then there is what seems like an exchange between Lunarians. There's no speech, but the body language is suggestive of the closest Lunarian wanting to look even more closely, and another Lunarian convincing them to return to the rest. Whatever is actually happening, I think it's plain that some kind of communication is happening between them. What's more, even if there is some kind of centralized control or guidance, this scene suggests that the Lunarian horde is nevertheless made of individuals. Maybe they are a eusocial organism, or there is something like hypnotic compulsion, or maybe it's just an incredibly regimented chain of command that is enforced telepathically, and there's just not enough information to guess. But that scene suggests they might have individuality to some degree, and Phos's choking bit suggests it further still. The other interesting scene is when Ventricosus is negotiating with Lunarians over releasing her brother. She is very clearly having a conversation, but all we hear is her half spoken aloud, which suggests both that the Lunarians can understand the spoken speech, and that they communicate in some other way that can nevertheless be understood. Ventricosus has spent some time among the Lunarians on the moon. It's safe to say she knows a lot more about them than the gems do. And so, notice how she doesn't just speak into the air, but lifts her head to address the largest Lunarian directly. When they reject her insistence that Phos is the best she can do, several of the small ones will burn her as though they are all responding to the same command in unison. That leaves me with a lot of questions, which is probably the whole point of introducing this right here at the end of the season. For starters, why can this captive Lunarian speak at all, if that's what it was trying to do, considering that they don't need to speak to each other, and they can even communicate with non-Lunarians like Ventricosus without doing so? Why are their eyes usually rolled up, and how are they able to see and act in that state? Is the larger Lunarian the same kind of thing, but higher in status, or some kind of control point for the others? Or what? Are the vast majority of Lunarians actually some kind of hypnotic captives, with only a small number of beings exerting control over the rest? It is very unusual to have an antagonistic force with no characterization, as we do in this series, but does this in-universe revelation help to explain it? I have no idea. And since I only know the anime-adapted portions, I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to have an idea. That this is to draw my interest towards buying the manga to learn more. What I do know, though, is that this should shake up my assumptions about the Lunarians to this point. And yet, it's another example of appearances being deceiving, a theme I introduced last time, but one that has run throughout the whole series. So, it's a good time to swap over to our theme section and begin with that one in particular. Like I was just mentioning, appearances are deceiving is a pretty constant pattern in our story, even though we only named it specifically in the last episode's video. An earlier thematic idea that I called What We Take for Granted has some overlap with this idea, but doesn't really fully encompass the whole scope of how it will intersect with the story elements. We ran through most of the examples last time, so I don't want to restate, and I'm just going to add this episode's before expanding on why I think it's so significant. A lot of what came up in our characterization section will apply here. Zircon turns out to be very uncertain, bordering on unstable when she is distressed, a contrast to our earlier impression, and especially as a counternote to Phos. Yellow's confident, casual presentation is further demonstrated to be more of a cope than a reality, and despite being the flashy speedster, it seems like she really just wants to stop moving altogether. It's not new that Bort has hidden and impressive depths, but it is reinforced this time, and we get to appreciate Zircon being fooled by appearances in the same way that Phos and the audience were earlier in the series. While Rutiel's overall competence and even temperament hasn't been overturned necessarily, she is no longer the unflappable one unmoved by setbacks. Indeed, her competence in gem repair begins to look more like a neurotic compulsion than a beloved craft. Alex likewise has a kind of compulsion, and to this point, she is presented as almost silly, even wanting to be called by the diminutive Chan honorific. Her moment of breaking into another role as a fighter still nevertheless had a note of absurdity to it. Yet, underneath all that was a fresh, raw hatred at her core, basically the opposite of a silly, low-stakes motivation. As we were just discussing, the Lunarian that Fos momentarily captures ends up having colored parts to its eyes and at least some capacity to make audible sounds. We had nothing but evidence to the contrary throughout the season, and it's that fact that makes it so notable. Shiro, of course, ended up being something quite different than first appearances did suggest. So too Kongo, even if we don't have a solid answer as to how much of a deception he represents. In that light, then, it perhaps shouldn't be surprising that the same may apply to the Lunarians. This has come up before, but I want to restate that this idea of ignorance of the true nature of the world is a core part of Buddhist philosophy. The world is not as it appears, and people must seek after the truth themselves. For a work with a lot of Buddhist echoes, the choice to have so many examples of deceiving appearances feels like a pretty deliberate one. Like, this isn't just a normal storytelling decision to keep the audience guessing and engaged. It is arguably a necessity, a repeated demonstration of how easily we can reach the wrong conclusion when presented with only a part of the whole. There's no better way to introduce a concept to an audience than making them an active participant. This theme also gains heightened significance from the future direction of the story. As I stated earlier, I wouldn't be surprised if the real myth arc of this world is chasing after the mystery of the world, with Fos in particular striving to uncover its myriad truths. I won't be surprised if Fos eventually begins to think not that appearances may be deceiving, but assumes that they will be, that nothing should be taken at face value. Even if she is jealous of her former self, the one that followed the simple hunches, she seems unlikely to return to that state. Now, while I do intend to release a video specifically focused on Buddhism elements in Land of the Lustrous, and am therefore paring back a lot of what I would talk about in this video otherwise, there are nevertheless a couple of things to mention so that we don't ignore them altogether. As just mentioned, the whole idea of appearances being deceiving has a lot of overlap. Something else I mentioned earlier, back in Conflicts, was the possible threat that Fos's missing memories might eventually present. That hasn't really happened yet, though her forgetting the story of humans might matter in the future. Instead, this time we finally get some idea of what she may have lost, along with her arms, in the sequence with Alex. Looking over the notes she collects leads Fos to realize that she has forgotten a lot of the lessons that Kongo gave her back when she was brand new, though she does have at least one short memory from that time. When Fos then sets about learning everything she can about the Lunarians, she is remarkably successful. Astonishingly so, to Alex Sensei's mind. It's almost like clearing out the memories she had lost with her arms and legs gave her a new blank slate to fill up with the information she really wanted. This reminds me of a particular Zen koan, though one perhaps more famous in the West than in Japan itself. And even if apocryphal, it will help to illustrate the point. It tells of a professor who came to ask a master about Zen Buddhism. As answer, this master poured him a cup of tea, yet when it reached the top, he continued to pour, spilling tea over the sides. When the professor pointed out the cup was full and no more would go in, the master replied that he was like the cup. He was full of his own opinions and speculations about Zen. How could the master add anything to his understanding? If he wished to learn about Zen, he must first empty his cup. Whether or not this happened, that sentiment of needing to first unlearn what one has learned resonates throughout Buddhist teachings, Zen or otherwise. In contrast to many other philosophies or religions, a lot of Buddhist schools emphasize that one must seek out truth oneself, forge one's own path, and not rely on hearsay from others about their journey. Thus, consider Fos. She has unlearned quite a bit, even if quite by accident, losing what is probably over half her memories absent her limbs. She has emptied her cup, whether she likes it or not, and has done so just as she prepares to embark on a long and personal journey of discovery. As she says to Podparachia, "I want to try and figure out the truth for myself." That sounds rather on brand now, doesn't it? And I think I will take the sequence with Alex and Fos and her impressive progress as evidence that it is working. There's one more thing in the general sphere of this Buddhist lens that I want to mention. The things you want, the striving after them, are one of the sources of suffering from the point of view of Buddhist thought. Getting what you desired doesn't lead to happiness, counterintuitively. Rather, it's that pursuit of truth that we just mentioned. And even that has its limitations if we take Podparachia's advice to heart. But let's look at that idea of how getting what you want doesn't make you happy. Rutiel woke Podparachia, and it took longer than it ever has before. With Yellow showing up later, we might also conclude that this might have been a much shorter window of awakening than ever before as well. And Rutiel achieving this goal shows us the first real distress we've seen in the whole show. Not happiness, not satisfaction, not peace. And Podparachia hopes that she will stop chasing after this desire. Yellow expressed a lot of anxiety over losing past partners, and seeing Zircon broken back in episode 6 made it seem like she wishes for a situation where that would never happen again. And yet, when Zircon is paired up with Bort, arguably as safe as she could be while still being in the fight, Yellow instead seems somewhat bereft. She more or less just fades out over the course of the episode, all but hibernating in the back of Alex's study. Even Alex expressed a desire to quiz Fos on the Lunarian material, desiring to play the role of sensei, and yet at the end, she is the one worn out by the exercise, perhaps even upstaged. And while the important part of Fos's job offer to Cinnabar still seems to have meaning, it is not at all the cool, fun job that she promised, that she had been looking for. In fact, 0% fun. Perhaps that pursuit of truth isn't supposed to be fun. Or perhaps one cannot hope to succeed if fun is what one wants from it. And to be certain, it is unlikely to lead to happiness. And that doesn't make it any less important. Lastly, let's revisit change versus permanence. Lots of stories have an element of this, but it has a heightened applicability to this work thanks to the largely unchanging immortal gems, contrasted with the Buddhist through-line which insists that all things are impermanent. I'd said previously that this thematic tension is most embodied in the person of Fos, and I think that's still true, even if this episode in particular was not a standout example. What particularly emphasizes this theme, not just for Fos, but many others, was the choice of how to end the episode, and therefore the season. As already mentioned, at the end of Cinnabar and Fos's last scene, Cinnabar repeats lines from the end of episode 1, but adds something new to them, something hopeful, something indicating she has changed over the course of what we've seen. That then leads into a montage where we take a survey of the Gem Society, and quite a few of those scenes have a deliberate emphasis on things changing. Yellow napping in Alex's study, Alex seemingly burned out on Lunarian studies for the first time ever, probably, Dia playing with stuffed animals rather than patrolling, Bort and Zircon paired up, Benito and Nepti having a different result to their game of rock, paper, scissors, and Congo being awake rather than meditating, to the visible shock of Jade and Euclase. Intermixed, though, are examples of some things not changing, of being more permanent. The first is Rutiel gazing over at Podparachia, suggesting she is still preoccupied with that quest. Red Barrel is still making new outfits that seem indistinguishable from earlier ones, and the Amethyst twins are still cracking their heads together, the Mad Gems, and Jade and Euclase are still carrying on with their administrative labor. But of course, the most obvious example is the last, which also mixes in both change and permanence. It's a replay of the second scene of the series, where gems are running through the grass before Morga calls out to Fos, even using the same dialogue. But Morga herself is different, having her hair tied up instead of down, and of course the Fos she addresses is quite different, standing watch with a sword, not lying idly in the grass. Fos will even walk past a memory vision of herself as she answers Congo's summons, making the contrast in both her appearance and bearing all the more unmissable. Her exchange with Congo also begins to play out the same in terms of what they say, and there's even a sudden flurry of birds from beyond the window. But the attitude of both parties is different. Change has occurred, and the story entices us to wonder just how much more change is in store. And that thought leads us nicely into speculation. A fair warning, this is going to be short compared to the entire rest of the story to come. As mentioned, the Norse manga has finished, and so many people now have a complete view of the whole, but at this moment, there's no indication that there will ever be more of it adapted into anime, even with as long as I have delayed this final chapter. Thus, any speculation I engage in may just be me screaming into the void. So, For entertainment value, as much as anything else, I will share a few things I expect. This is largely just something to amuse source readers though, which is why we'll keep it truncated, and then we'll move on to the last question and answer section. The first thing I would guess about the future of the story is that Phos will continue to change, and not in the normal way that characters change. Earlier in our coverage, I brought up the idea of the 7 treasures or 7 jewels of Buddhism, types of precious gems or metals that represent the 7 qualities or practices that Buddhists should strive towards. While the exact list of 7 varies by tradition, the gold and agate that Phos has added to herself are on those lists. Thus, if this holds water, she might add as many as 5 other kinds of material to herself as the story progresses. I think that still makes sense, as I'm sure it presents a tempting possibility for a storytelling. The only thing I would update to this speculation is the idea that it might not all be literal. That is, she might take something into herself that is just as important as a change like the arms or legs, but is not a physical addition. It was Padparachia this time that inspired this thought, she with the missing pieces. Ruby is what they used to patch her, and ruby is one of those 7 jewels. But maybe instead of literal ruby affixed to Phos, maybe something like Padparachia's advice could stand in for the ruby portion of the 7 treasures. Certainly, her repetition of the advice at the end suggests that it's part of Phos now, that it will guide her path in the times ahead. Another guess should come as no surprise, but I speculate that Ventricosus and perhaps other Admirabilis will come back into the story. Even if Phos has lost some memories associated with her time below the waves, she seems to retain the ability to communicate with the things of the sea. She will therefore be drawn in to anything involving them, even if she wasn't the central character of the story. I'm amused, imagining how that might go down. Phos doesn't remember that she was tricked into being captured by the Lunarians, that she was betrayed by Ventricosus, and so she couldn't relate that fact to Congo or the other gems. However, Ventricosus won't know that, and might be expecting to have to explain herself and allay suspicions. Speaking of suspicions, I also imagine that Congo will not turn out to be someone with deceptive ill intent towards the gems. Rather, there is some reason that he believes they are better off ignorant of his connection to the Lunarians, and he seems to especially believe they should remain ignorant of humans, based on his reaction to Phos knowing the word. As an aside, I noticed rewatching that while Yellow did not recognize the word either, it's entirely possible that Rutil did. When Yellow remarks about how Sensei seemed off, Rutil will be rather insistent that it's because of frustration over Phos's missing memory. At the time, I thought both of them being there and not reacting was to suggest that no gems knew about humanity. But this was before we knew about Padparachia, she who knew everything, and she who was Rutil's partner. When I rewatched that scene then, I realized I can't actually rule out that Rutil knows something, but that she also believes it should remain hidden. Somewhat related, in the past I speculated that the soul, flesh, bone story was probably close to the truth, even if elements ended up being metaphorical. Like, it's not literally the segregated soul, flesh, and bone of humanity, but the idea that our 3 species each embody different aspects of humanity still seems like something that could bear out. Lunarians being warlike when no one else is, Admirabilis being enamored of the pleasures of the flesh when the other 2 are not, gems being immortal and mostly unchanging when the others are changeable or even insubstantial, and so on. I'd thus also speculate that Congo knows the truth of what happened, and it figures into why he behaves the way that he does. I do have one more speculation, but first, some things that I can't guess. I don't think I can speculate about whether or not we ever see the moon itself, though I admit it would be a tantalizing setting for a climactic part of the story. Because of that, it's hard for me to guess if we'd ever recover any kidnapped gems, particularly Antarcticite. I speculated at one point that the Lunarians may not even be capturing the gems solely for the sake of having them, but because of taking away Congo's reason to be down on Earth. I'm not sure I feel any more sure or any more uncertain of that idea. However, I don't really have a good guess as to exactly what Congo is to the Lunarians. I've suggested some ideas about Buddhist figures he could be, but there's nothing in the story to give us a reading one way or the other. Ventricosus being unable to eat him suggested he was nothing like the gems, and yet he is so hard that you wake him up at your own risk. He can't be mortal, considering he's always been there for the gems, and yet he isn't insubstantial in the way of the Lunarians. He's an enigma, but a deliberate one, considering how the story seems to be going. Thus, my last speculation, with a condition. If this story is as closely wedded to Buddhist thought as it seems, then my speculation is that it will eventually evolve into something quite unlike the usual way we think of stories being about the pursuit of goals, rising and falling actions, try-fail cycles, journeys. In fact, the fuzzy shape of the story as I imagine it, if it goes this way, is one that some people would increasingly feel disconnected from. It might become quite alien indeed. But I did say if. I think there is a reasonable chance that this story could ultimately be a criticism of Buddhism, not an endorsement. It's impossible to tell from where I am in the story, though, because either outcome, or even a third option, just exploring the idea, could all begin in the same way that this one has. This possibility is actually one of the things that came up in the dialogues during our live stream, and I've therefore included it in our final section, Questions and Answers. As mentioned at the beginning, years ago I watched this episode for the first time in front of a live audience on Twitch. That stream had its technical difficulties, as often is the case, the most amusing of which was my Amazon Echo interpreting me saying Alex Sensei as Alexa, and deciding to resume my music playlist in the middle of the stream, forcing us to restart from the middle once I figured out what was going on. Awesome. After my viewing, though, we spent a little time talking about what I had just seen. I was asked a series of questions, and luckily I got to answer most of them. As a way to wrap up our episode-by-episode coverage of this series, then, I want to answer some of these questions again, and some that I was unable to at the time. I have paraphrased a lot of the questions themselves for clarity and brevity. First up, a two-parter, based on a comment that I made during an earlier video. Do I still rank Phos as one of my favorite heroines? Yes. Next question. Okay, yes, and certainly no less than when I first made the statement. Something most of my favorite heroines have in common is the way they serve as something of a canvas for the story, a canvas that events and other characters paint themselves onto. When you look back on a story at its end, or a significant milestone, like right now, you should be able to see the progression of the tale written into the character as they exist at that point. Phos is a more literal example with her physical changes, but that's not really what I mean. Being a canvas means being receptive to others. It means being changeable. A certain dynamism and capacity for empathy are implied. However, to really be compelling, they should not be entirely changeable, not a completely blank slate. A passive character is more difficult to cheer for. Thus, a strong starting character with recognizable core traits who nevertheless changes as they encounter others or navigate events. Phos rather has that in spades. She's never quite lost her starting smugness or flippancy, and despite it all, still has a kind of wide-eyed wonder about each new development. And as Kongo long ago noted, she has a kind heart, which came up early and still remains. And yet, her growth has been substantial, and with this episode in particular taking time to highlight the contrast with where we began. This, though, I would consider the bare minimum. What really pushes Phos over the edge is that she's someone I want to root for, and I want to root for her because her goals resonate with me. And not all of them, either, like her whole bit about wanting to join the fight because she thinks it's important or she thinks it's cool, that wouldn't have been enough. Rather, it's the things she does for others that get me to cheer for Team Phos. The fact that learning someone was worse off than her was all it took to kickstart personal growth is not just endearing, it's inspiring. Realizing that no one else in their society was moved to action the way she was, that makes it downright heroic. I want her to succeed. I'm invested. The fact that she doesn't take a straight line is all the more compelling. Almost right away, Phos thinks about trying to get out of her promise to Cinnabar. But that is because her initial character traits have inertia. She wasn't simply set up as someone who needed growth so that there was room to show it. She truly was the idle, kind of bratty little pebble that the others looked down on. It's thus all the more remarkable that she endures, that she never truly forgets that she's working towards changing Cinnabar's fate, even on the eve of her very first day in the fight. She constantly made mistakes from a place of ignorance, and she did not suddenly learn all she needed as soon as the narrative demanded. But she didn't stop trying. As Antarcticite said, "Walk until you can't, and then walk some more." And Phos did. So the second part of this question then is, okay, enough about Phos. Do you have a favorite gem besides her? And as I said then, I have a soft spot for Cinnabar, who presents as so vulnerable and whose attempts to cover that up make her seem more vulnerable still. As we mentioned earlier, she actually changes very little over the part that we've seen, but as a foil to the ever-changing Phos, this works out well. When we get something like a movement on her right at the end, it has that much more significance for seeming like part of Phos's great triumph in pursuing that all-important initial goal. You see, we have different standards for main characters and supporting characters, with this being a good example of how that can work out. And Cinnabar is also someone easy to root for. For all the ways her society has let her down, she still shows up in a pinch. She saves Phos, repeatedly, even though it pains her to use her mercury and destroy the life around her. And hey, tsundere types are popular for good reason, okay? I'm not made of stone. I'd say Rutiel is another. I liked her anyway, as someone sensitive and smart, yet shot through with a trollish and mad enthusiasm, but the added depth from this 12th episode really pushes her up the list. Also, the moment when she was able to dissect the Shiro puppies without trouble, when even Bort couldn't bring herself to smack them, was some peak humor. Now for a non-gem answer, you best believe I'm going to choose Ventricosus. What a great character. And for a lot of the same reasons as I gave for Phos. Episode 5 is one of the standout episodes of this series, in my opinion, and it's largely because of her. The antagonizing dynamic between her and Phos in Episode 4 is amusing and endearing for them both, a seeming unserious counterpoint to the crisis of Phos being eaten, only to swing the other way with her betrayal. And yet, just as Phos was, we can hardly be mad at her when we understand why. When she puts herself at risk to refuse trapping Cinnabar and defies her brother to ensure that Phos gets home safely? Well, again, I find her easy to root for. I want to see her again. So, next question then, favorite moment from the show? Now, I'm not really in the habit of ranking or paring down favorites, and even though I did so just now for the first question, I really could have kept going. I could have given an answer for each character. So, I will give you a handful of short answers. And I can at least tell you that it's not the scene where Dia fights the snail. So, to continue from what I said about Ventricosus, the moment when she comes over and touches Phos when she is lamenting the things that she hasn't done really struck me. It encapsulated a lot of the fun and frantic relationship the two of them had, and it's hard to believe it was less than 2 episodes. Ending by embracing her and saying, "Let's go home," as the cloud evaporates was such a mood. Phos's exchange with Cinnabar after she washes up just after that somehow even elevates it further. See, like a lot of people, I also really liked the end of episode 8 when Phos gets her golden arms and Antarcticite is taken. This seems to me like the most obvious candidate for the Land of the Lustrous moment, if you know what I mean. Phos arguing with a part of herself, the Super Saiyan-like unveiling of the golden petals peeling back to reveal her new power-up, and yet the desperate scramble that ends in failure as a counternote. The things she says to herself during that pursuit, all the things she's accomplished and improved, and yet still seems like she will fail. There's just so much of the story in microcosm in those few minutes. Another easy choice is right at the beginning, when Phos tries to save Cinnabar by holding out the clipboard and having her arms yoinked off for the trouble. This leads to Cinnabar dropping her own arm, revealing that she is the lowest Mohs scale of them all, while Phos is streaked with mercury for her failed attempt. The tone shifts throughout that scene really contributed to my excitement for the series ahead. Those moments when the clipboard and the handprint came back into the story, even just later that same episode, They always felt powerful to me because of where we began. Another favorite is just before spring, when Fos is trying to mend Kongo's robes and is introspectively looking out the window at winter receding. She's deeply changed at that point, and luckily snaps out of it a bit, and her fear and sense of loss is really palpable, despite how even-keeled and even stoic the scene is rendered. It's a really deft touch, I thought. On the other end of that spectrum, though, Fos being completely gobsmacked when she encounters Red Alex will never stop being funny, and it goes right into the swarm of Shiro puppies. I don't think Fos's eyebrows return to their normal resting place for 3 full minutes. Alright, next question. How did Cinnabar manage that luminescent blush? Well, I have no idea. A blush is the result of increased blood flow to capillaries near the surface of the skin, which is difficult to accomplish without blood, or capillaries, or skin. Perhaps her innate redness was so intensified during that moment that it overpowered the powder that the gems usually cover themselves in, and it's just fortunate that she is reddish. If she were a green or blue gem, maybe at that key moment we would have gotten a Cinnabar that looks like she was about to be sick. Or, I guess the boring answer is that it's just visual shorthand, and in fact, several different gems had moments of blushing during the season. But I'm just going to pretend I didn't say that. Speaking of appearance, the next question was more like a whole battery of comments, which basically boiled down to, what do you think about Kintsugi? Apparently, people have been waiting for me to bring it up in one of these videos. If that wasn't you, though, let me quickly explain. Kintsugi, golden joinery, is a Japanese art form concerning the repair of broken pottery with a lacquer infused with precious metal, most famously gold. The resulting repair is not invisible, but actually accentuates the cracks from the original break. That is, it celebrates the imperfections, the attention drawn to transience, the idea of beauty emerging from hardship or failure, and so on. It adds to an object's uniqueness and has a bit of overlap with other Japanese philosophical ideas. After Fos gets her golden arms, which are way too heavy for her weak frame, she frequently will crack under the strain. The fluid gold, though, runs through these cracks and eventually forms a mesh throughout her body to support her. In a way, then, she appears to be something similar to this Kintsugi idea, and considering the overlap with Buddhist sensibilities, you don't have to squint too hard to see something to it. So, this was my answer. Maybe? The pattern is there, but not yet the meaning. The key part of Kintsugi is making the imperfections more visible than they would be otherwise, celebrating the uniqueness and the past breakage. Fos is not doing that. Not yet, at least, which is why it hadn't come up in anything I'd discussed. She doesn't revel in the scars of her past. In fact, once the others are awake, and at first are spooked by her arms, it suddenly occurs to her how weird she is, and she gets Rutil to cover up her legs with powder, hiding the agate as well. That seems to me the opposite of the Kintsugi idea. However, that may be a setup for the Fos of right now to contrast against the Fos of some later time. Maybe she will come to celebrate all her breaks and cracks and the evidence of them that she carries. Certainly, I think that as much as Fos has grown, there is still plenty of room left, and maybe this will be proof of some future milestone reached. Now then, the question I referred to earlier. Do I think Land of the Lustrous is actually a criticism of Buddhism? I don't think I should feel confident in any answer I give right now, knowing that I've only seen part of a larger story. If it's meant to be a flattering portrayal, it might show downsides within part of the story, and then vice versa if it was meant to be critical. And if it was only an exploration of Buddhist themes and outlooks, then we might expect both positive and negative examples of Buddhist ideas in action. That all seems like a cop-out, so let me point out some things that might eventually be worth taking into consideration. The first is simply that a very faithful and enlightened practitioner of Buddhism would make a pretty terrible character. That has nothing to do with the merits of Buddhism itself, but rather those of storytelling. Buddhists attempt to extinguish the fires of desire and avarice and ignorance. The word nirvana literally means to blow out these flames. Well, Guess what qualities make for a compelling character? I'd said in an earlier video that Phos was practically the anti-Buddhist. She wanted what she didn't have, she didn't want what she did have, and she spent her days in idleness and ignorance. She was deeply flawed, driven by whims and hunches, unserious. And as I stated at the beginning of this section, she makes for an absolutely great main heroine. Buddhists are meant to let go of attachments, and yet Phos attaching herself to Cinnabar and striving for her sake is one of the most endearing and important of her actions. Now, we might point out that as Phos began to grow, she came to more closely resemble someone pursuing Buddhist enlightenment. She's certainly a better person now than when we began, and we might argue it was because of the things that she has let go of and her pursuit of a path out of her ignorance. We know she's still in the middle of that journey, and so it's conceivable that over the entire story, she draws ever closer to a more Buddhist ideal and away from those qualities which make for an intriguing protagonist. If you did that close enough to the end of the story, her transformed self wouldn't necessarily be around long enough to stop the work in its tracks. As a counterpoint to that, though, the thing that jump-started this change for her was not the relinquishing of desire, but the adding of more, that of the quest for Cinnabar. She had something entirely new to feel dissatisfied about, and became more keenly aware of the suffering in the world. Another place we might look for an answer is in the character of Kongo. With his kessa and robe and shaved pate, he presents as a Buddhist monk, and his habit of napping, meditating, helps complete the picture. If Kongo is meant to be something of a spiritual leader in the Buddhist tradition, then his success or failure in guiding others, or in mastering himself, might be said to reflect on the validity or falsity of Buddhist thought. To oversimplify that, if he turns out to be the big bad, then this might not be meant as a flattering portrayal of Buddhism. If he's complicated or misunderstood, that too might be part of an answer to the question. One of the poignant scenes I mentioned earlier was Phos contemplating the end of winter and the onset of spring, and during that introspection, she starts to leak gold from her eyes. She's crying, basically, and apologizes for it. By way of explanation, Kongo says that it's merely a defect found in ancient organisms and nothing to fault yourself for. That would seem to indicate his attitude towards Phos's emotional display, that it's a defect. And yet, I have to imagine that the audience does not share this assessment. That seems, in fact, rather cold, no? Yet perhaps not inconsistent with the Kongo who may be pursuing Buddhist ideals. Thus, how sympathetic Kongo comes off to the audience is perhaps another indicator of the work's overall intent in its portrayal of Buddhism. I am sorry that I don't know the full work, and so can't give a very convincing answer in any direction. As mentioned at the outset though, I do intend to release another video on this series which focuses specifically on Buddhism and how it shows up throughout. Like I mentioned when first bringing it up, it has a habit of invading all the other elements of this episode, and so I thought it best to give it its own space. As a standalone video, we can also range over the entire season instead of constantly delineating by episode, and I hope that will aid in clarity. Again, I hope to get that out sometime this winter. Now, finally, the last question. This one from Dirac 2012. Is there going to be an analysis video on YouTube? Yes.